In this lecture, we'll be looking at the life and work of Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese revolutionary figure before the First Indochina War, so roughly from 1890 to 1946. Ho Chi Minh was the prime minister from 1946 to 1955 and the president from 1946 to 1969 of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which is better known to Westerners as North Vietnam. Ho led the opposition to the Japanese occupation of Vietnam in the Second World War, and he also led the Vietnamese independence movement after World War II. One of the most important historical debates revolves around whether Ho should be considered a communist first or a nationalist first. That is, was Ho a communist ideologue who opportunistically used Vietnamese nationalism for his deep political beliefs, or was Ho a sort of half-hearted communist whose real motivation was Vietnamese nationalism and independence? And historians and political scientists will continue to debate this, I'm sure, long after. Ho was born in central Vietnam, grew up in relative simplicity, although he came from an educated family. His real name was Nguyen That Tan, which is spelled on there. Ho Chi Minh, which is a name he later took for himself, means he who enlightens. His father was very unwilling to compromise with the French over time. He lost the best job that he had. He had been a magistrate until he was demoted after a landlord that he had ordered to be beaten by cane in a case died soon after the caning. Ho's father, Win Sin Sak, held very strong nationalist beliefs, and he taught his children to oppose French authority. Ho's family was fully involved in its opposition to French authority. Ho, for example, participated in some tax revolts against the French as a teenager. As a child of 10, Ho was sent by his father to a French school in Vietnam, or French Indochina as it was called at the time. At the age of 19, Ho jumped aboard a ship destined for the United States, and he learned about the world as he worked in jobs in places like restaurants and factories in western cities such as New York, Boston, London, and Paris. Ho learned a great deal about Western political traditions in his travels. He read many of the works, for example, of Marx and Lenin. He also developed interest in nationalist ideals with contacts that he made, especially with a group of Korean nationalists he worked with at an auto plant in the United States. Ho was quite fond of the ideas of Lenin, especially his beliefs in a revolutionary vanguard who could direct a revolution. The image on this slide is of Ho when he was in Paris in 1919. He would be about 29 years old in this picture. Ho was involved in the formation of the French Communist Party in the early 1920s in Paris. He attempted to gain French sympathy for Vietnamese independence, but he was annoyed that French communists did not seem to take seriously the cause of Vietnamese independence. His disappointment in the French, and in particular in the French communists, was one of many such experiences in dealing with Western leftist groups, and this may have pushed Ho toward nationalist groups. Ho Chi Minh was, as we mentioned, upset by indifference to Vietnamese independence by Westerners, especially Western radicals in the 1920s. French communists and the French people were split in the issue of colonialism. Ho Chi Minh published his beliefs in France in an effort to bring French radicals around to anti-colonialist ideology. And at one point he felt that the French, and even the French radicals, were kind of paternalistic toward him, and that they didn't take seriously Vietnamese independence because they didn't consider the Vietnamese to be as politically and economically evolved as the modern French, quote-unquote, were. Due to his irritation in part at the French communists, Ho traveled to Moscow, where he was employed by the Comintern, or Communist International, for a few years. By 1925, he was working for the Comintern in Shanghai, China. At one point, he may have been involved in turning in to police a Vietnamese communist for a bribe. He traveled around Asia in the 1920s and 30s, as well as making a few trips back to Europe, spreading his beliefs. He was sometimes imprisoned, particularly by the Chinese, for his political activism. During his wide travels, Ho learned at least 6 languages. The outbreak of World War II gave him sort of a reinvigorated focus for his political activism. He founded the Viet Minh to coordinate nationalist groups calling for independence, some of whom, again, were communist or at least radical in their political outlook. He organized help from Chinese nationalists and got some help from American officials, including the forerunner to the CIA. The name Viet Minh translates roughly as the League for the Independence of Vietnam. The group formed in 1941 in opposition to Japanese occupation of French Indochina, but it was drawing again heavily on existing nationalist groups. And later in World War II, after they began to sense that France fully intended to reoccupy Vietnam, the Viet Minh began to oppose a return to French colonialism and even began attacking French installations as they were. In the image on this slide, British OSS members are posing with Viet Minh leaders Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap during training in August 1945. You can see Ho a little bit to the left of center, and Giap a little bit right of center. By 1945, the Viet Minh may have had as many as 500,000 members, so they were a very potent military and political force. As the war came to a close, conflicts between the Viet Minh and other Vietnamese factions were starting to heat up. There are documented assassination attempts, some of which were successful by Viet Minh operatives against leaders of both nationalist and leftist groups. There's some dispute as to whether these were orchestrated from the very top or whether these were carried out by local factions, because as the Viet Minh at this time itself was somewhat divided between pro-nationalist and pro-communist ideologues. So they were still settling that issue within their group, let alone within the country. European colonies in Asia demanded independence, but France refused to give up the idea of reclaiming its Asian colonies. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had been a staunch anti-colonialist, especially earlier in the war. There's some indication that later in the war he seemed to be moving away from that position a little. But either way, his death in 1945 put Harry Truman in the Oval Office. Truman definitely lacked FDR's knowledge of global geopolitics, and his desire to placate the French in what was emerging as the Cold War meant that he would not be much of an ally to Vietnamese nationalists, and in fact was outwardly hostile to the idea of Vietnamese nationalism. Unfortunately, the American advisors on the ground viewed Ho Chi Minh as the best alternative, but they were not listened to by the folks in Washington. Vietnam declared its independence. Ho Chi Minh encouraged Bao Dai to abdicate, and Ho emerged as the leader of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Ho sent numerous requests to the U.S. to establish relations and to negotiate with the U.S., but was repeatedly rebuffed by American officials in Washington. Interestingly, the Proclamation of Independence of the DRV quoted extensively from the American Declaration of Independence. The first few lines are word for word. So again, this is one of those moments where you look and you see Ho, and you wonder if he is truly a communist ideologue, hardcore ideologue, or if he's really a nationalist at heart. Because he's definitely sending signals at this time in 1945 to the United States that he wants to play ball, but unfortunately the U.S. does not take him up on his offer. Many historians and political scientists argue that this was the ideal time for the U.S. to befriend Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, but instead the U.S. decided to back French colonial schemes in Southeast Asia. And if Ho Chi Minh had strong nationalist views, or at least nationalist views that were strong enough to trump or put aside his communist views, he was forced by this inaction on the part of the United States to look elsewhere for assistance. After the Second World War drew to a close, the British forces occupied southern Vietnam, while Chinese nationalist forces Chiang Kai-shek occupied northern Vietnam. Ho had greater fear of the Chinese than the French, and he entered what he believed to be a temporary truce with the French to get the Chinese forces out of the country. Ho later said this, plug your ears if you don't like profanity, but it is what it is. I'm just quoting history. The last time the Chinese came, they stayed 1,000 years. The French are foreigners. They are weak. Colonialism is dying. The white man is finished in Asia, but if the Chinese stay now, they will never go. As for me, and here's where the profanity comes in, so close your ears if you don't like cuss words, I prefer to sniff French shit for 5 years than to eat Chinese shit for the rest of my life. End profanity. The British ceded control of southern Vietnam to the French in 1946. Chinese forces left at that time also. They had much bigger fish to fry in fighting Chinese communists. The French made an agreement with Ho that his DRV would exist as an independent member of a French union in Southeast Asia in exchange for the French keeping 25,000 troops in northern Vietnam. Ostensibly, they claimed that they would stay until 1951 as a protection against the return of the Chinese. The return of the French, of course, in 1946 sparked immediate resistance. This quickly took on the form of a violent independence struggle, especially after the French ignored earlier deals and bombarded the port of Haiphong and occupied Hanoi in late 1946. But this draws to a close our brief initial look at the pre-First Indochina War Ho Chi Minh.